Picture this. It's 1978, and a 62-year-old fisherman in Hokkaido is outrunning Honda-powered fishing boats using an engine that runs on sake, not gasoline, not diesel, rice, wine, the same stuff you drink with sushi. And it's making more power, burning cleaner, and costing a fraction to operate. Honda's engineers will spend 2 years trying to figure out how he did it before the Japanese government mysteriously bans the whole thing. The two-stroke problem in Japan. Late 70s. Context. To understand why this story matters, we need to talk about Japan in the late 70s. The country was in the middle of an environmental crisis that makes modern concerns look quaint. Tokyo's air was so polluted you could barely see across the street some days. I'm not exaggerating. Visibility would drop to a few hundred meters. Children were wearing surgical masks to school, not for viruses, for smog. The Sumida River in Tokyo was legally classified as an open sewer. You could develop chemical burns from swimming in it. The government was cracking down hard on emissions, and their primary target was two-stroke engines. Motorcycles, outboards, chainsaws, anything that ran on premix fuel was in the crosshairs. Now, here's the thing about two-strokes. They're simple, powerful, lightweight, and cheap. They're also dirty as hell. A two-stroke engine burns oil mixed with fuel, creating that characteristic blue smoke that environmentalists absolutely hate. The combustion process is inherently inefficient. Unburned fuel and oil escape through the exhaust port during the scavenging cycle. It's not a design flaw. It's how the engine works. Hydrocarbons pour out in quantities that would make modern emission standards spontaneously combust. By 1978, Japan had essentially declared war on two-strokes. New emission standards were being phased in that would effectively ban them from most applications by 1982. The regulations were brutal. Carbon monoxide limits dropped by 60%, hydrocarbon limits by 75%. Particulate emissions had to be cut by 80%. There was no way a conventional two-stroke could meet these standards without strangling its performance into complete irrelevance. The fishing industry was terrified. Small fishing boats, the kind that supplied most of Japan's domestic seafood, the family operations that had been running for generations, they all ran on two-stroke outboards, and for good reasons. They were simple enough that fishermen could fix them at sea with basic tools, drop the lower unit, replace the water pump impeller, clean the carburetor, maybe swap a spark plug. You're back fishing in an hour. They were light enough to mount on small boats without affecting stability or requiring reinforced transoms. And most importantly, they were cheap enough that a family fishing operation could afford replacements when engines inevitably died after years of saltwater abuse. Honda saw an opportunity. They'd spent the entire 70s perfecting small four-stroke engines. Their automotive division had mastered the CVCC engine, which met 1975 emission standards without catalytic converters. Revolutionary technology at the time. They applied this knowledge to marine engines. Their four-stroke outboards were cleaner, more fuel efficient, and produced more consistent power than two-strokes. On paper, they were superior in every measurable way. The emission numbers looked fantastic. The fuel economy was 30% better. The torque curve was smoother, except for one tiny problem. Fishermen hated them. Honda's stranglehold. On small engines, four-strokes are complex. They have valve trains, camshafts, oil pumps, timing chains, all sorts of stuff that can break. And when you're 20 miles offshore in rough seas and your engine dies, you don't want to be diagnosing valve timing issues. You want to pull the spark plug, maybe clean the carburetor, and get running again. A two-stroke you can practically rebuild with a pocket knife and determination. Four-strokes are also heavy. The Honda 50 horsepower four-stroke outboard weighed 165 pounds. The equivalent two-stroke Yamaha weighed 98 pounds. On a small fishing boat where every pound matters, that's a huge difference. That extra weight sits on the transom, affecting trim, stability, and fuel consumption. For boats under 20 feet, it was a genuine safety concern. And they were expensive. A Honda four-stroke cost 3 times what a Suzuki two-stroke cost. For a fishing family operating on thin margins, that price difference wasn't just significant. It was potentially business-ending. You're asking a guy who nets maybe 3 million yen a year to spend 1.2 million on an engine. That's insane. But Honda had the government's ear. They'd spent millions on emission technology. They'd positioned themselves as Japan's environmental leader. They ran ads showing children breathing clean air thanks to Honda innovation. The subtext was clear: buy Honda or poison your grandchildren. The marketing was relentless. Honda sponsored fishing tournaments. They gave discounted engines to fishing cooperatives. They ran technical seminars showing fishermen how 4-strokes would save them money in the long run. The sales pitch was slick, professional, and mostly bullshit. Because here's what Honda didn't advertise: 4-strokes break in saltwater environments, the complex valve trains corrode, the oil pumps fail, the timing chains stretch. Fishermen were finding that their expensive Honda engines needed professional service every season. 2-strokes you could maintain yourself, so 4-strokes required certified technicians with specialized tools. But the emission laws were clear: 2-strokes were dying. Honda was positioning itself to dominate the market. They had the technology, the manufacturing capacity, and most importantly, the government's blessing. By 1980, Honda controlled 47% of the Japanese marine engine market. Yamaha had 32% with their newer 4-strokes. Suzuki was dying at 15%, clinging to their 2-stroke heritage. The writing was on the wall: convert to 4-strokes or go out of business. Enter Takeshi Yamada, the Fisherman. Nobody expected enter Takeshi Yamada. Yamada was exactly what you'd expect from a Hokkaido fisherman. Weathered face, missing part of a finger from a net accident, smoked like a chimney, drank like a sailor, because he was one. He'd been fishing the waters off Hokkaido since 1946, right after getting out of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now, here's what made Yamada different. In the Navy, he'd been a machinist mate on destroyers. He knew engines, really knew them. He could rebuild a diesel from memory, and had spent the war keeping temperamental Japanese marine engines running under combat conditions. When your destroyer is under attack and the engine quits, you don't have the luxury of calling a technician. After the war, Yamada bought a small fishing boat and worked the squid and crab grounds. By 1978, he was running a modest operation with 3 boats. Nothing fancy, but enough to support his family and a couple of crew members. He specialized in winter crab, which meant running in conditions that would keep recreational boaters in port for months. His problem was the same as every small-scale fisherman. The government wanted him to switch to 4-strokes, but he couldn't afford 3 Honda engines at 400,000 yen each. That's roughly $12,000 in today's money. For 3 engines, for a guy pulling in maybe $30,000 a year total. The math didn't work. So Yamada did what any rational person would do. He ignored the law and kept running his old Suzuki 2-strokes. They worked fine, they were reliable, and he could fix them himself. He'd rebuilt each engine at least twice. He knew every bearing, every seal, every tolerance. But Yamada had another problem nobody talks about. The gasoline situation in Hokkaido was a disaster. The nearest fuel dock was 12 kilometers from his home port. In winter, getting there meant navigating through ice. Sometimes fuel deliveries wouldn't come for weeks. Yamada would have to make special trips just to get gasoline, wasting time and fuel. Time he could spend fishing. The fuel situation was getting worse. OPEC was playing games with oil prices. Japan was panicking about energy security. Gas prices were climbing every month. What cost 200 yen per liter in January was 240 by December. If for boats that burned 300 liters a week, this was crushing. One night in December 1977, Yamada was drinking with his crew. They'd had a good catch and were celebrating with sake. Lots of sake. Yamada, being a curious guy even when drunk, started talking about how sake and gasoline were both flammable liquids. One of his crew members, as a joke, suggested they try running the boat engine on sake. Yamada, drunk enough to think this was brilliant, actually tried it. The sake's engine concept. He grabbed a bottle of cheap sake, mixed it 50-50 with gasoline, and dumped it in the outboard's tank, started the engine, and it ran. Not well, but it ran. The engine coughed, hesitated, but kept firing. It smoked differently. The exhaust smelled like a distillery. But the engine was running on alcohol. The next morning, sober and embarrassed, Yamada should have forgotten the whole thing. but he didn't. Because somewhere in his Navy-trained mechanical brain, something had clicked. Alcohol has a higher octane rating than gasoline. It burns cooler, and most importantly, it was available locally. Hokkaido produced rice wine. A lot of it. There were sake breweries in almost every town. The stuff was cheaper than gasoline because it wasn't taxed as fuel. What if, Yamada thought, you could modify a two-stroke engine to run on pure alcohol? The idea was insane. Nobody ran engines on sake, but Yamada had time, a workshop, and a spare Suzuki two-stroke he'd pulled off a retired boat. He started experimenting. Two-stroke engines are stupid simple. Fuel and air mix in the crankcase. The piston moving down compresses this mixture. A spark plug ignites it. The explosion pushes the piston up, which simultaneously compresses a fresh charge in the crankcase below. It's elegant in its simplicity. No valves, no timing chains, just controlled explosions and moving metal. The problem with alcohol is that it needs a different fuel-to-air ratio than gasoline. Gasoline wants about 14.7 parts air to 1 part fuel. This ratio, called stoichiometric, provides complete combustion. Alcohol needs about 9:1. You need to flow more alcohol to make the same power. The chemistry is different, the energy density is different. Everything changes. Yamada's first modification was simple. He drilled out the carburetor jets to flow more fuel. He started with the main jet, going from a 1.2 millimeter orifice to 1.8 millimeters. This let more liquid through, compensating for alcohol's different stoichiometry. He also richened the needle position and enlarged the pilot jet. But alcohol has another property. It evaporates slower than gasoline. Gasoline is volatile. At room temperature, it wants to vaporize. Alcohol is more stable. In a cold Hokkaido morning, where temperatures dropped to -10 Celsius, this meant the engine wouldn't start. The alcohol just wouldn't vaporize in the intake tract. Yamada solved this with an electric heating element wrapped around the intake manifold. Nothing fancy, just resistance wire from a hot plate connected to a battery. It warmed the intake air enough to vaporize the alcohol. Once the engine was running, exhaust heat would keep things warm. But for starting, you needed that electric assist. The compression ratio was the genius part. Gasoline engines run compression ratios around 8 or 9 to 1. Higher compression means more power, but also more heat and more risk of detonation. Gasoline's octane rating, usually around 90 for Japanese pump gas, limits how much you can compress it before it self-ignites at the wrong time. Knock and ping mean destroyed pistons. Alcohol has an octane rating of about 108. You can compress it much more before detonation becomes an issue. Yamada milled the cylinder head, removing 3 millimeters of material. This raised the compression ratio from 9 to 1 to 12.5 to 1. He was essentially building a race engine. The result was remarkable. The engine made more power on alcohol than it did on gasoline. Yamada's testing showed a 23% increase in peak horsepower and a 30% increase in torque. The 50 horsepower Suzuki was now making 61 horsepower. The engine was also running cooler because alcohol absorbs more heat when it vaporizes. This is called evaporative cooling. But here's where it gets interesting. The emissions were incredibly clean. Alcohol combustion produces mostly water vapor and carbon dioxide. No particulates, no unburned hydrocarbons, minimal carbon monoxide. The blue smoke that characterized two strokes completely disappeared. The exhaust was nearly invisible. Yamada had accidentally created an engine that was more powerful, cleaner, and cheaper to run than any four-stroke Honda was selling. Technical breakdown. How it actually worked. The fuel cost was absurd. Cheap sake in Hokkaido cost about 80 yen per liter. This was the industrial grade stuff, not the refined sake you'd drink. The bottom shelf product that sake breweries practically gave away because nobody wanted it. It was harsh, unfiltered, basically one step above paint thinner, perfect for burning in an engine. Gasoline was 220 yen per liter. Now, here's where the math gets interesting. Alcohol has less energy density than gasoline, about 30% less, so you burn more of it to get the same work done. Detroit engineers would look at this and say, see, alcohol is inefficient. You need more fuel. They'd be missing the point entirely. Even burning 30% more alcohol, Yamada's operating costs dropped by 60%. Let that sink in for a second. The fuel was so much cheaper that Even though he used more of it, he still saved massive amounts of money. Let me break down the actual numbers, because they're genuinely shocking. Yamada's boats typically used about 300 liters of fuel per week. This was running roughly 40 hours, pulling nets, dodging weather, doing everything a fishing boat does. On gasoline, that's 66,000 yen weekly. Multiply that by 4.3 weeks per month. You're looking at about 340,000 yen monthly. Switch to sake. Now you're burning 390 liters weekly because of alcohol's lower energy content. That's 31,200 yen per week. Monthly cost drops to 136,000 yen. The difference is 204,000 yen monthly. Over a year, that's 2.4 million yen saved. In today's money, almost $7,500. For a small fishing operation scraping by on thin margins, that wasn't just savings. That was survival money. That was the difference between keeping the boat or selling it. That was being able to afford a new net when the old one tore instead of spending 3 days hand repairing it. That was hiring a crew member instead of working alone. That was actually putting money in the bank for the first time since Yamada had bought the boat. Think about what that meant. Yamada could underbid every other fisherman at the dock and still make better profit. He could work fewer days and make the same money. He could actually take time off, something commercial fishermen almost never do. But the economics weren't even the most impressive part. The performance improvements were equally significant, maybe more so. The higher compression ratio meant better throttle response. Twist the throttle and the engine responded immediately. No lag, no hesitation. The engine felt stronger at low RPM, which mattered enormously for pulling nets and maneuvering in tight spaces near the dock. You needed precise control at low speed. Yamada's Seike engine delivered it better than any gasoline two-stroke he'd run. The cooler running temperature meant the engine could sustain high RPM longer without overheating. This sounds minor until you understand what crab season demands. You're running at 3/4 throttle for 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours straight. Gasoline engines would heat up, lose power, force you to back off. Yamada's Seike engine just kept pulling, hour after hour, running cool enough that you could touch the cylinder head without burning yourself. The maintenance interval shocked him. Conventional two-strokes needed rebuilds every 500 hours. Maybe 600 if you were lucky and careful. Yamada ran his Sake engine for 900 hours before doing a precautionary teardown. What he found inside changed his understanding of engines entirely. The combustion chamber was cleaner than any gasoline engine he'd ever opened. No carbon deposits caking the piston crown. No varnish coating the cylinder walls. No black crusty buildup around the exhaust port. Just light brown residue that wiped away with a rag. The piston rings showed minimal wear. The cylinder bore still had visible cross-hatching from the factory hone. He kept this quiet for about 6 months. Yamada wanted to make sure it actually worked before telling anyone. He ran his boats through Hokkaido winter, through rough seas that kept most fishermen in the port, through everything the North Pacific could throw at a small boat. The engines performed flawlessly, better than flawlessly. They performed better than they had on gasoline. The secret testing period. In summer of 1978, another fisherman noticed Yamada's boats didn't smell like gasoline. They smelled like sake. The guy, a fellow named Hiroshi Tanaka, asked what was going on. Yamada, after swearing him to secrecy, explained. Tanaka didn't believe it, so Yamada showed him. They pulled an engine, demonstrated the modifications, explained the theory. Tanaka was convinced. Within a week, he'd converted his own boat. Word spread through the fishing community like wildfire. Within 3 months, 12 other fishermen in Yamada's port had converted their engines. By spring of 1979, the number had grown to over 40 boats across 3 different ports. This represented maybe 5% of the small-scale fishing fleet in southern Hokkaido. This was all happening underground. Nobody was advertising it. Nobody was selling kits. Fishermen would just show up at Yamada's workshop, and he'd help them modify their engines. Sometimes for free, sometimes for a bottle of good sake, always quietly. He'd drill the jets, mill the heads, install the heating elements. The whole conversion took about 6 hours. The performance gains were consistent across all the conversions. Every engine showed increased power, decreased operating costs, and cleaner emissions. Some fishermen reported their engines running smoother with less vibration. Others noted the engines lasted longer because alcohol doesn't leave carbon deposits like gasoline does. One guy claimed he went 2 seasons without changing spark plugs. The fishing community developed a whole subculture around the sake engines. They'd trade notes on which sake brands worked best. Industrial sake with higher alcohol content worked better than drinking sake. They'd experiment with different compression ratios. Some guys went as high as 14-1, though Yamada warned this was pushing the limits of the cast aluminum pistons. One guy even tried using shochu, a distilled liquor with higher alcohol content, and reported even better performance. But shochu cost more than sake, negating some of the economic advantage. The sake engines also required different maintenance schedules. You had to change oil more frequently because alcohol washed past the rings and contaminated the crankcase oil, but oil was cheap, and the engines ran so much cleaner that everything else lasted longer. But someone eventually talked. In November of 1979, a journalist from a local newspaper heard about the sake engines and wrote a story. It was supposed to be a positive piece about ingenious fishermen finding creative solutions to expensive fuel problems. Instead, it triggered a crisis. Honda finds out. The article caught the attention of marine industry publications. Within a week, it had spread to the national automotive press. Engineers from Honda, Yamaha, and Suzuki were suddenly very interested in what this fisherman had built. This wasn't supposed to be possible. 2-strokes weren't supposed to meet emission standards. Alcohol wasn't supposed to work as a marine fuel. Honda sent 3 engineers to Hokkaido in December. They met with Yamada, examined his engines, and asked for a demonstration. Yamada, proud of his work and naive about corporate politics, agreed. He took them out on his boat in conditions that would normally ground most vessels. Heavy seas, near freezing temperatures, the kind of weather that makes outboards temperamental. His sake-powered engine started on the first pull and ran flawlessly for 6 hours straight. They ran at full throttle. They idled. They accelerated hard. The engine never hesitated. The Honda engineers were impressed and terrified. Because if a 63-year-old fisherman with hand tools could build an engine that outperformed their 4 strokes using technology they'd considered obsolete, what did that say about their engineering? What did it say about the millions they'd spent on research and development? One of the Honda engineers later admitted, off the record, that they'd tested Yamada's engine at their facility. They borrowed one of the converted engines, ran it on a dynamometer, and analyzed the emissions. The results were shocking. The engine met every single emission standard the government had set for 1985. It was cleaner than their best 4-stroke, and it cost 1/10 as much to build. The power curve was remarkable. Peak horsepower came at higher RPM than gasoline, but the torque curve was broader. The engine pulled harder at low RPM and sustained power better at high RPM. For marine applications, this was ideal. You wanted low-end grunt for net pulling and high-end power for running in rough seas. Honda had a problem. They'd invested millions developing 4-stroke technology. They'd positioned themselves as the environmentally friendly choice. They'd convinced the government to effectively ban 2-strokes. And now, some fishermen had proven that 2-strokes could be cleaner than 4-strokes if you just changed the fuel. The implications were staggering. If alcohol-fueled 2-strokes became mainstream, Honda's entire marine division strategy would collapse. They'd spent years convincing customers to pay triple for 4-strokes. Now, those customers would see they'd been conned. The government ban. The corporate response was predictable. In February of 1980, Honda published a white paper claiming that alcohol-fueled 2-strokes posed unspecified safety risks. They cited concerns about fuel volatility, though alcohol is actually less volatile than gasoline. They worried about storage issues. Though sake had been stored safely for centuries, they claimed potential engine failures, though Yamada's engines had been running for 2 years without problems. None of these concerns were backed by data. None addressed the fact that Yamada's engines had been running flawlessly for over 2 years in the harshest marine environment in Japan. But Honda had something Yamada didn't: political connections. By April of 1980, the Japanese Ministry of Transportation had issued a preliminary notice. They were considering new regulations that would restrict the use of non-standard fuels in marine engines. The justification was safety and environmental protection, which was hilarious considering alcohol engines were cleaner than what they were trying to mandate. Let me translate that. Honda lobbied the government to ban alcohol fuels before they threatened the four-stroke market. The fishing community fought back. They presented data showing the Sega engines were cleaner, more efficient, and more reliable. They pointed out the cost savings. They noted that alcohol production was a domestic industry, reducing dependence on imported petroleum. At a time when Japan was still reeling from OPEC oil shocks, this should have mattered. None of it mattered. In July of 1980, the ministry issued final regulations. Effective January 1st, 1981, marine engines could only use approved fuels. The approved list included gasoline, diesel, and kerosene. Alcohol was not approved. The official reason was safety. The ministry claimed alcohol's different volatility posed fire risks. They cited concerns about fuel system compatibility. They worried about standardization. They claimed they needed time to study long-term effects. But everyone knew the real reason. Honda and the other major manufacturers had successfully killed a technology that threatened their market position. They'd used government regulation as a weapon against innovation. Yamada was furious. He'd proven his concept worked. He'd shown it was cleaner and cheaper, and the government had banned it to protect corporate interests. He tried fighting the regulation. He wrote letters to his representatives. He testified at hearings. Nothing worked. The underground legacy. Some fishermen kept running sake engines anyway. They were small enough to avoid inspection and remote enough to avoid enforcement. There are rumors that even today, in isolated fishing villages in Hokkaido, you can still find boats running on modified two-strokes burning alcohol. But the moment had passed. The fishing industry was forced to adopt four strokes. Costs went up. Maintenance became more complicated. Small operations struggled. Within 5 years, the number of independent fishing families in Hokkaido dropped by 30%. Some went out of business. Others sold to larger operations. Honda won. But here's what's fascinating about this story. Yamada wasn't wrong. Everything he'd proven was correct. Alcohol can work as a marine fuel. Two strokes can be clean. Simple engineering can outperform complex corporate solutions. Modern engine designers are rediscovering this. Ethanol-blended gasoline is now standard in many countries. E-Baso 85 fuel, which is 85% ethanol, is used in high-performance applications. Formula One engines run on fuel blends with significant alcohol content. The technology Yamada pioneered in 1977 is now being researched by universities and corporations, spending millions on development. They're discovering what he already knew. Alcohol is a viable fuel. High-compression two-strokes are efficient. Simple solutions often work best. There's a deeper lesson here about innovation and industry. Yamada succeeded because he had a problem that needed solving. He wasn't trying to maximize profit margins or protect market share. He just needed a reliable engine that didn't cost a fortune to run. Honda failed because they were protecting their position rather than pursuing better solutions. They had the resources to develop alcohol-fueled engines. They chose not to because it would cannibalize their four-stroke sales. This pattern repeats throughout automotive history. The best innovations often come from outsiders who don't know what's supposed to be impossible. Yamada didn't know alcohol engines couldn't work, so he built one that did. Today, if you search for Takeshi Yamada, you won't find much. He died in 1998 at 82 years old. His workshop is gone. His boats were sold off. The sake engines were converted back to gasoline or scrapped. But in certain circles, among marine engineers who study alternative fuels, his name comes up. There are technical papers that reference his work, usually without attribution. There are patents filed by major manufacturers that use principles he discovered. The establishment won the battle. They banned his engines, protected their market, and erased him from history. But they couldn't erase the idea. You can run engines on alcohol. You can make two strokes clean. You can outsmart corporations with better engineering. Somewhere in Hokkaido, there might still be a fishing boat running on sake, puttering along, burning clean, making power, costing almost nothing to operate. A mechanical middle finger to every regulation that said it couldn't exist. That's the real legacy of Takeshi Yamada. Not the engines themselves, but the proof that sometimes the best solutions come from the people who actually need them, not the corporations trying to sell them. Every time some engineer at Honda or Toyota files a patent for alcohol-adapted engines, they're walking in the footsteps of a fisherman who figured it out in his garage 4 decades ago. They've got billion-yen budgets, computer modeling, advanced materials science. He had hand tools and too much seihi, and he got there first.